Hello, and thank you for joining this WriteHive annual conference panel, Fairytale Retellings, How to Reinvent in Fresh and Mindful Ways. My name is Stefanie, and I'll be the panel moderator today. I have several accomplished panelists with me, so if you have any questions for them, please drop them in the chat and we'll make sure to answer them. But first, let me introduce you to our panelists. First, we have Lauren T. Davila, who is a Pushcart nominated Latina writer currently pursuing her PhD in English at Claremont Graduate University in California. She holds an MFA in fiction writing from George Mason University and dual BAs in English and creative writing from Pepperdine University. After completing her studies, she plans to teach at the collegiate level while publishing poetry and fiction. Her writing has appeared online in several journals and magazines, and she has multiple short story anthologies publishing in 2022. She is currently seeking representation for multiple projects, including a YA novel, picture book, a short story collection, and a book of poetry. Besides her personal creative work, she is the acquisitions editor for Catstone Books, a judge at NYC Midnight, and editor-in-chief for Foothill Journal. She lives in the Los Angeles suburbs, where you can find her drinking decaf rose lattes and swimming. Lauren, please share with us a little bit more about you.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to our panel. So excited to chat with you all today and talk a little bit more in depth about some of the anthologies that I have in the works, including a fairy tale retelling anthology.
Thank you so much. Our next panelist is Rebecca F. Kenney. She is a self-published author of fantasy, romance, and retellings, as well as several anthologies. She is currently represented by Eva Scalzo of Spielberg Literary and looks forward to being a hybrid author someday soon. Before she transitioned to fiction writing full-time, she worked for a small educational publisher and then was a freelance nonfiction writer. She designs covers as a side hobby and a creative outlet. Rebecca lives in upstate South Carolina with her husband and two awesome kids. Rebecca, can you please share more with us about you?
Sure. Yeah, I love retellings. I've always loved reading them and really enjoy writing them too, because there's so much potential to twist things up and switch it around. One major thing that I've been doing lately is writing serial stories for Kindle Vella. And I've seen like a huge amount of success with that. So that's been a lot of fun. And I have a retelling I'm going to be doing on there pretty soon.
That's awesome. Thank you. Next, we have Marisa Noelle, a writer of middle grade and young adult novels in the genres of science fiction, fantasy, horror, and mental health, including The Shadow Keepers, The Unadjusteds trilogy, The Mermaid Chronicles, and The Unraveling of Luna Forrester. She is a mentor for the Write Mentor program that helps aspiring middle grade and young adult authors. With dual citizenship, Marisa has lived on both sides of the Atlantic and uses settings in both the US and UK as inspiration for her novels. When she's not writing or reading or watching movies, she enjoys swimming. In the pool, she likes to imagine she could be a mermaid and become part of some of her make-believe worlds. She lives in the UK with her husband and 3 children. Marisa, please tell us more about you.
I think that kind of covers it. But what I will say is that I am prone to a bit of method research. And I recently I bought my own mermaid tail to my husband's total horror, and actually swam in the ocean with my mermaid tail, because I thought if I'm going to write about them, then I need to know what it feels like. So that was lots and lots of fun. So yeah, there's a little fun anecdote for you.
I respect that. I think that's amazing. All right, so those are our panelists. Why don't we go ahead and jump right into our questions? Starting with, what is it about fairy tales that makes them such good fodder for stories? Lauren, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So I think for me, I think it's the scope. And I feel like in terms of characters versus plot, fairy tales are about even for me. Like it's not one way or the other where it's just so character based or it's just so plot driven. And I also think like the world building is just like built in. Like there's obviously such a mythic scope to fairy tales. You can do anything with a fairy tale, and there's so many retellings out there, but every single one, no matter who's writing it or when it's been written, it's always so different. And so I think the imagination, like the scope for the imagination with fairy tales, is just never ending.
Good point. Marisa, how about for you?
Yeah, I totally agree with those comments. And I kind of think that I ummed and ahed about this question, and I was thinking about the world building, what you said, Lauren, that the world building is inbuilt. And, even if you do like a Marissa Myers and you turn your Cinder retelling into a sci-fi kind of thing, and that's a whole total different world. You still have the expectation of the story and the certain rules that are going to happen within that story. So it's the comfort of the familiar. There's the comfort of these stories that have been told for over 100 years and that we have a certain expectation. And what I think is so refreshing is the way that an author may take that story and freshen it, whether it's a gender inversion or there's an LGBTQ element, or whatever they decide to add to that is what I think it gives us comfort of the familiar, but also gives us something brand new as well. And I think that's why we can use all of these fairy tales and Greek myths and Roman myths, all of those things, and keep retelling them in so many different ways. It's so exciting. Yeah,
it is. Thank you.
Yeah.
Rebecca, what do you think?
Well, I agree with everything they said. Fairy tales have a lot of strong universal themes. They also have a fairly simple plot structure. So it's easy to take that core, like that skeleton of it, and just build on that however you want. And a lot of the times these fairy tales have they're stories of overcoming things like gaining wealth or love, against all odds, overcoming the villain. And I think, that's universal. So even now, like when we're facing so much trauma in the world, really, it's especially important to have stories like that, where the characters triumph over something or work through something, or, in a way, Cinderella, she gets to be with her prince and she gets to be rich, right? So whatever your dream is, even if it's not that, overcoming the challenges, the obstacles. And of course, there were a lot of moral lessons in those. And, we don't want to be preachy with our retellings, but, sometimes you can have something in there that's really going to help somebody through whatever they're going through.
So tell us about your fairy tale retelling. How did you choose the story you retold, or what was the spark of inspiration that drew you to the story? Rebecca, why don't we stay with you?
Well, I've done a number of them. The one I have up on the background here is a retelling of Renard the Fox from French mythology. That's like a medieval thing. But probably my most popular retelling has been my Peter Pan one. I always loved the Disney movie of Peter Pan, and I had the biggest crush on Peter Pan. And I used to lie awake at night and be like, why doesn't Peter Pan come and get me? So as an adult, obviously, I enjoy romance stories. And so I decided to age the characters up, and make it spicy. And it was just a lot of fun to just take it. And I really built up the fae element to it as well. So it was just so much fun to write. I wrote it for my Patreon patrons back in 2020. And it was just like an experience, just all of us sharing that story during that time, so I have like a super special place in my heart for that one. And then after it was on Patreon for a year, I put the duology on Amazon, and it's done really well there too. So yeah, it's like
I need that story in my life. Yeah. I'm like, after this, I'm going ka-ching. I'm going to be reading that. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Marisa, why don't you tell us about yours?
Yeah. Do you know, I did start out as a retelling. There are certain retellings that I have my eye on and that I really want to do, but I haven't found my way into them yet. And I often find that if I start with the concept, I can't. And it was only once I had a certain idea for this story, the Unraveling of Luna Forrester, and it was only once I'd written it that I realized that it was a retelling. So obviously I had been influenced subconsciously from my love of Grimm and fairy tales and growing up with Disney and all of those things. And once I realized that it had this element, that's when I thought in subsequent drafts, I leaned into it a bit more and I added those little details to kind of pull it all together a bit more. And that's when it all kind of finally made sense to me, because I thought not only is this the original story I had in mind, but it's also a reimagining of some people's favorite and a really common retelling, as in Little Red Riding Hood. So that's how I kind of went about it. And I think for me, if I think too hard about the original story, I kind of struggle to find my own way in, my own angle. So often if I come out of it from left field, then I find it a fresh angle. At least I hope. So yeah.
Love that. Thank you. Lauren, how about you?
Yeah, so I feel like mine is a little bit different because I have such a background as an anthologist. So like personally, I've published one short story right now that was a retelling of Greek myth, specifically Cassandra. It's a YA retelling of it, or set at a high school prom. So definitely very different retelling of that. But for multiple of my anthologies, including this, where's it? This one right here. There's a couple of fairy tale retellings within that one, and I'm actually currently co-editing, and we're in the process of compiling all the stories for it right now, but a BIPOC fairy tale retelling with a co-editor, Joe Wu. And so we're in the process right now of finishing and finalizing some of those stories, and that's been about a process over about a year, and it's been really, really interesting to see all of these stories come in from all around the world, and how many different possible retellings you can have of like Cinderella or the 12 Dancing Princesses, and every single one, depending on culture and race and background, is so different. And so I think that that's been the interesting process, to see all of them sort of gathered together and sort of seeing how everybody enters a specific fairy tale from a different perspective. So that'll be in the future. We're planning to start putting that out on submission within the year. So it's definitely a future project, but we're in the midst of that right now. So that's the major project that I'm working on in terms of fairy tale retellings.
Amazing.
Lauren, can I just pick up on something you said that about?
Yeah.
I think that's really interesting about when you're coming from different cultures and different countries, and you are bringing a different interpretation of those stories, and how and when you grew up with them, and which version you first saw. And that brings so many different layers to a retelling, I think. So I thought that's a really interesting point that you made. Just saying, absolutely, and that's why you can have so many different kinds, so many different angles. It's just absolutely fascinating.
And
I can't wait to read this. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. And I think sometimes too, like the actual fairy tale itself can differ in its original format, depending on culture and country. And so that's also been interesting to see how people reinterpret endings or specific characters or character arcs throughout, where in my mind, I may be like, oh, I didn't remember how that's going, but after some more research, you see that that's maybe how they grew up with that fairy tale or heard it in their specific culture. So it's been really rewarding so far, and it's very, very fun.
Good.
Actually, that's kind of a great lead into our next question, which is, when you were writing your fairy tale retelling, did you research the original works, and what, if anything, did you want to alter about those originals? If I could jump to Rebecca.
Yeah, so I did read the original Peter Pan, the novel from, I think, the 1920s. I think I'd read part of it before, but I was kind of shocked at how dark it was for a child's book, and just like some really weird stuff in there. And obviously, when you're dealing with some of these older classics, you want to be really careful about certain content. Like the original Peter Pan is very racist in parts, extremely so. I was very surprised. Like I suspected some just from, there's some things in the Disney movie, but it's way worse in the book. So obviously, and you got to avoid all of that, so you got to be really careful when you start dealing with some of these things. So I just, in reference to Tiger Lily and her people and all of that, instead of having an Indigenous group in my Fae retelling, I just removed that part because I'm not qualified to write about that. So I focused on diversifying the cast instead. Instead of the lost boys, I have the lost kids. So there's, all genders, and some of the characters are queer. They're a more diverse group. So yeah, I did read the original, and I pulled some like little things, like if you're familiar with the original, which I don't think a lot of people are, but if you are and you read my retelling, you'll find some little cool Easter eggs in there from not just the Disney movie, but the actual book. There's a bit in there, believe it or not, about the fairies coming back from an orgy and stepping over the sleeping Peter Pan on the ground as they're coming back from this. And I was like, what is this doing in a children's book?
Wow. And you had to slip it in.
And I feel like, yeah, I used it in a different way. But I feel like, for a kid's book, some of the characters are kind of, over-sexualized, including Peter himself. So I felt way more comfortable about like aging everybody up and everything in that respect. But yeah, it was really interesting just to see how dark and off the wall some of these old books are. We all know that about Alice in Wonderland, for example. But yeah, so if you ever have the chance, like go and read it because it's quite the ride.
Very curious now. Marisa, how about for you?
I've totally forgotten what the original question was now. I'm so engrossed in Rebecca's answer.
We love it. Did you research the original works, and what, if anything, did you want to alter?
I did, because I came at it from a not intending to naturally do a retelling and only leaning to that after, I didn't. And I think because Red Riding Hood is such, is one of the ones that's been retold so many times throughout our history, I felt like I had enough in my head of all the different versions, and that's what I wanted to draw on. And I think for me, sometimes when I go back to the original, I get too locked into the original and trying to make it different. Sometimes I can't see my way out of that. So sometimes I'll only go back to it after I've written the first draft and said, okay, what can I get out of that now that I've got my story down? But I didn't actually in this case. But I might now, retrospectively, maybe. And I do, but for other stories I have done, but not for this one in particular. So
awesome. Great. So what methods did you use to make your story fresh and relevant for modern readers? I think we've talked a little bit about this already, but maybe we can dive a little bit deeper. Lauren, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So I feel like, as you kind of said, I feel like we've kind of started touching on this, but I think for me, it's really about representation. So I think, as I'm talking about creating and curating this anthology specifically for BIPOC voices, I think it's really just sort of diversifying diversity across the board in terms of the characters and in terms of the settings, whether or not we're sort of bringing the fairy tale into the modern world, which I think has a whole different set of rules and connotations in terms of the world building with that, or if you're really keeping it in sort of the fairy tale world setting. And so I think for me, it's just, I guess I would say diversity really, and just making sure that the people who are reading it see themselves on the pages and in some of their favorite fairy tales that they've grown up with. I think it's really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Excited for that. Marisa, how about for you?
Yeah, I totally agree. And just expanding on that, diversity to include all of those minority groups. And my big thing, when I write horror, I write dystopian, I write fantasy, but I always have mental health. That's a really real passion project for me, and I cannot help but my characters happen to have mental health conditions, and it's never a plot device, and it's never something that they have to overcome. It's just something that they have to deal with throughout the story that can change the way they make decisions or change the way they deal with certain situations. So for me, when this book is hugely about mental health conditions, and I always like to try and include that. And I think with any retelling, it's really interesting to see if we can bring up the feminism or the equality or the race or the gender or the sexuality and all of those things. How can we invert all these traditional tropes to make them as meaningful and appropriate for our current audiences, especially in YA, because that's where I write, and having that influence and having teenagers grow up with knowing it's okay to be whoever they are is super important.
Agree. Thank you for that. Rebecca, how about for you?
Well, I already touched on, making them a little more diverse and making sure certain people groups are all included. So I'll go a little different route with this. So at the beginning of mine, Wendy, she hasn't been back to Neverland for 10 years, and she's working IT, in an office, like in a cubicle, and answering somebody's questions on the phone about how to unlock their account. And Peter Pan's shadow shows up on the wall of her cubicle, you know. And so there's a little bit in there about how she knows about tech, you know, technology and stuff like that. And so a little bit of, you know, science, technology, engineering, and all that for girls in there. And I have a whole universe that this duology is set in. So there's a bit about how the technology from the different realms in this universe can be cobbled together, and like, you know, how they use it in Neverland. So I kind of brought the technology in a little bit. I feel like that's kind of weird maybe, but also sort of fun, you know, because all these different realms would have developed their technologies in different ways. And the people Pan has brought from the different realms, including from Earth, you know, they each brought something with them. And so they have to create like this blend of it all, I guess. So yeah, I was trying to use tech in the fairy tale, and we'll see if it worked or not. I think it does.
I think the mashup of that is super exciting, and I cannot imagine the headache
to
plan out what tech belonged to what world.
I don't go super in depth with it.
Yeah.
And I kind of like gloss over part of it with like, well, magic, you know, magic makes it work.
Absolutely.
Magic is the world building. That's all.
Right?
That's all we need to say.
Yes.
Love that. So, are there elements of yourself that you've written into your main characters intentionally or not? And I want to start with our mermaid swimming Marisa.
Yes, I think there always is. And even though all my main characters, you know, from one book to another are different, there's always the core of them is always very similar to me, their value system. And I think that, you know, like the mermaid series I have, I love swimming. I would have loved to have been a mermaid. So, you know, that's my passion. But also because I have this mental health thread across all my books, I struggle with mental health issues. I've had anxiety since in my 20s. And, you know, I'm a dinosaur. So that was before you could Google what a panic attack was and things like that. And I didn't have books that represented me, or even books that I could turn to explain to me what I was going through. So it's super important to me to not only provide escapism, but also show people that can struggle and still save the world, you know, that they're not crippled into not being able to do that because they've got this extra baggage, and that it's normal to have this bag that you carry around with you and have to deal with sometimes. So definitely a little bit of me goes into some more than others. Yeah.
Makes sense. Absolutely. Lauren, how about for you?
Yeah, I feel like there's always some sort of little something that pops up. So one of a couple of the short stories that I'm working on, somebody has like a journalism background, which is something that I'm familiar with. I feel like there's always like it's always good to have a little jumping off point when you're writing something that maybe is so, you know, in another world. There's always something nice with some sort of familiarity. One of the others that I'm working on is a retelling of the ballet Giselle. And so that one, obviously I have a ballet background, but I'm bringing that into it. So it's nice to have that little like base level in order to build some of those world building elements on top of. So I think for me, it tends to happen more in either setting where somewhere I'm familiar with. I have a lot of stories based in the Los Angeles area, no matter how sci-fi, fantasy, speculative they get. Or in terms of just sort of what Rebecca was touching on with the IT, like it's always nice to have some sort of job familiarity or essence familiarity for a character. Yeah. So I think it sneaks in there no matter what.
Makes sense. Yeah. Rebecca, same to you.
Yeah, so same as Dave said, you know, I feel like things definitely do get in there. I kind of divide up my issues between my characters, I guess. Like Ixiana in Prize of the Warlord, which is in another series of mine, she has like my breathing issues and my dietary issues. And then I also wrote an Apollo and Cassandra retelling, and she's got my depressive tendencies. I tend to get very depressed in between books. Like when I'm not writing something actively, I get super depressed. So, and then I have headaches sometimes. So I put that for another one of my characters, Grace, in one of my stories. She has those. So it's like none of them are totally me, but they all have like little pieces So yeah, and I guess Wendy in the Pan books, she is probably less like me in some ways. But she's a very sassy, strong character, and her dreamer aspect of like, she doesn't want to be on Earth. She wants to be back in Neverland. Like, she just wants to sort of the escapism mentality, I guess, that a lot of us readers have. That would be what I put in from me to her.
Yeah, that makes sense. And also getting to hang out with Peter Pan, right?
Right.
So what are some of the benefits of fairy tale retellings? Again, I think we've definitely delved into this a little bit, but maybe we can dive deeper. Rebecca, why don't we stay with you?
So like we've said, it's a familiar structure. So it's comforting in a way. A lot of these stories, we've grown up with. And another thing that I thought of as we were talking earlier about the different cultures and fairy tales and myths across cultures, it's so interesting to see how myths from very widely different or even like geographically distant cultures have a lot of similarities sometimes. I've noticed this before, and it's like, it's so cool. It's like these universal themes. They speak to everyone. And so it's that, but it's exciting too. You've got the familiarity, but then you've got the excitement because you're like, where is the author going to take this? This is so cool. And I don't know if any of you have read Kirsten White's King Arthur books, her King Arthur retellings. She's done a wonderful job with those. And it's just like, you read something like this and you're like, man, that's exactly what I would have done with the story. I love it when that happens. I'm like, this is exactly the way I hoped it would go. I love that. And they always surprise you. I think maybe it was Lauren who said, like, you're always surprised because every author brings their own background, their interpretation, the things that they want to emphasize, the point they want to get across, and it just makes each one so exciting. You can have a million Beauty and the Beast retellings, and it's still fun to read them. Like, I'll read all of them.
Same.
So, yeah.
Marisa, same question. What are some of the benefits of fairy tale retellings?
Totally what Rebecca said is that familiar crutch. I think when you grow up with a movie or a story and you start to identify, I know little girls would want the big wedding dress or to be Snow White or and be swept off their feet by Prince Charming and things like that. And although we need feminism and things like that, I still want to be swept off my feet and I still want chivalry. So I love to see how those things are handled, like the recent Cinderella movie with the singer, I can't remember her name, who did Havana song, which was a feminist. Yeah, so it was beautifully done and I loved it, but I also loved like the original The Slipper and the Rose back from God knows when it was the traditional retelling, because I am a romantic at heart and I do want to be swept off my feet, and so I want to see the familiar, but I also want to see people standing on their own 2 feet and that fresh, so it's that crutch the familiar, I think, and it's just you're leaning into a story that has taken you to bed night after night after night, and it's the same story but it's different, and so it becomes so exciting to see how those things change. That's my very long-winded answer.
Important though, thank you.
Yeah.
So what should writers be most mindful about when they are retelling fairy tales? Lauren, let's start with you.
Yeah, I'm trying to think because I feel like we've kind of touched on this, but I think it's just bringing your own unique spin to it. And I think not getting caught up in, there's, X amount of, as Rebecca was saying, like Beauty and the Beast retellings out there. Like, why does mine deserve to be published? Or like, why should I even write this one? And I think it really, you just have to chalk it up to the fact that like everybody is going to have a different take on it and a different spin on it, and sort of be confident enough to like write it and know that what you're writing is unique and is your own retelling and own spin on it. And I think that that's the beauty of the fairy tale retellings. Like, they're always going to be different. And, I think even as I'm sitting here going through all of these anthologies, like I could do an anthology like just on Beauty and the Beast and have, 25 different retellings of just that
I would read that
fairy tale. Yeah. And every single one of them would be completely different. And that's the beauty of it, is that there really is so much that you can do with this sort of setup of a fairy tale. So just, I guess that's what I would boil it down to, just like know that your version of it is going to be unique.
Love that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Marisa, same question.
Yeah. Do you know, I think it's not to be afraid to veer too off the path of the original story. And I think to make it as different, or, you know, and like my own book, for instance, I say that because really, you know, there are only glimmerings. I mean, my character, she has a red coat and she journeys through the woods and she needs to get to grandmother. But that's where the similarities stop. You know, so there are these glimmerings of Little Red Riding Hood, but that's where it ends, and it's her own journey. And I think, you know, whether you want to tell a close story or, you know, snowball your ideas, brainstorm your ideas, and, you know, if you want to do sci-fi and space with Cinderella, do that, you know, because I think, or you want to take Cinderella back to Egyptian times, or just really experiment with how different you can make it and how far away you can take, but to take those same themes. And then I think it's really important to not get stuck, you know, to create modern viewpoints, as we've touched on with, you know, POC and gender and all those things. It's really important to make sure that you are including your diverse cast, and not to get stuck into the formula that a lot of these stories were very whitewashed and racist in the day. So to really make sure that we cover that appropriately.
Thank you. Rebecca, same question.
So things to be mindful about, as Marisa said, you know, just, and as we've already mentioned, just being aware of the latent ableism, racism, queerphobia, and all of that. That's in a lot of these, or you know, even if it's not there actively, just by omission, you know. And I'm still working on that, honestly. Sometimes I don't see it, you know, and I have to like think harder. So like with someone who's white, like myself, and cis and all that, it's important to think even harder, like, what are we missing here? Who's like, how can I make this, how can I help other people see themselves in the story? Or like, you know, even if it's not my job to necessarily speak the viewpoint, but how can I include everyone, you know? And that's why it's so important to have readers, sensitivity readers, if you are going to go in particular directions with your fairy tale that aren't necessarily in your lane, you know, that's important. And just, you know, being aware of all of that. Also, you know, a lot of these fairy tales, some of them had like really preachy, they were really preachy fables. And so you don't want to like hammer people over the head with the original moral lesson of the myth or the fairy tale or whatever it is. Some of these really old ones, it's just, you know, and some of them are really gross, like the original Cinderella. Yeah. So, you know, just be mindful about your audience, your current audience. And like, people don't want to be hit over the head with these, you know, moral fables. But at the same time, you know, it's important to also, like, I always try to, like Marisa said, you know, the mental health aspect of it. I want to make people feel good when they're reading my books, feel happy, feel supported, you know. So if I can accomplish that through a fairy tale, you know, that's just amazing to me. And that's like my ultimate goal. So
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Amazing. Thank you, Rebecca.
Yeah.
So are there examples of fairy tale retellings in other books or movies that might inspire you? Lauren?
Yeah, I'm trying to. One of the ones that I've been thinking about is the Cursebreaker series by Bridget Kemmerer. Not too certain if you guys are familiar with it, but the main character in that novel is chronically ill and is sort of thrust into this fairy tale world, and so that is something that I think is so interesting. And we're talking a lot about diversity in that element, and so that was one of the ones that I automatically think of. And then I know this is the TV show Once Upon a Time, which I don't, yes. Yeah, I knew as soon as I said it that you all were going to do, yeah. Which you know, there are some things that are not great about it, but what's really, really good about it is really, really good. And I think that that's one example of taking fairy tales or myths or any sort of story and just jumbling it all up and throwing it and seeing what sort of sticks. And so that I definitely would say always influences me. Especially in terms of like combining fairy tales or moving certain tropes or characters around. I think I like watched that show at a very formative young age, and it just influenced me for everything I wrote thereafter. So those would be my major ones that I can think of.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Rebecca, do you have a fairy tale retelling you'd like to shout out?
Okay, so I've read the Bridget Kemmerer books too. So good. She's such a good writer. So on the romance side of things, well, I know there were a bunch of Peter Pan retellings before mine, and there have been a bunch recently. And one big one in romance land right now is The Never King by Nikki St. Crow. That is very dark. It's RH, so if you like reverse harem romance, that's one you could check out. On the lighter side, like the YA side, there's an indie author, Catherine McDonald, who writes really good fairy tale retellings. They're just so fun. The banter, she's so good at funny banter. So I love it. As far as movies go, there is a Russian movie. I Am Dragon is the English title. It's a Beauty and the Beast thing. And the dragon, kidnapping the maiden or whatever. But it's so well done. And you should watch it in the original language with the subtitles. It's just great. I love it so much. And the French version of Beauty and the Beast, exquisitely beautiful. Also watch it in the original language. There are some stunning retellings out there. And I mean, the French version of Beauty and the Beast, just the aesthetic, the visuals, amazing. So those are things I would recommend.
Yeah, absolutely.
All of our TBR and to watch lists have now grown.
Bigger, much bigger.
So do you think that there may be more fairy tales in your future works? And if yes, what can we look forward to? Lauren, I know you've got a few things coming.
Yeah, so I would say like throughout all of my anthologies, there's definitely going to be retellings in there, reimaginings. I always look for those. And in terms of what I'm doing with work for Capstone Books as an acquisitions editor, like I'm always looking for fairy tale retellings and reimaginings. So definitely on the more of the editing side. For my personal work, I'm starting to go back into working on a higher YA and a retelling of the Greek fates in a ballet studio. So that is something that I am starting to draft. So that'll be a few years out, but that's what I'm working on personally. So besides my editing and anthologist work.
And Marisa.
Yeah, totally. I love a retelling, and my agent says that retellings are always hot. So my Mermaid series is actually kind of like Little Mermaid Grows Up meets Romeo and Juliet. So I have the first book out now, and it's a 5-book series. So that will all be coming, and the whole theme of the book is this love, this betrayal, constantly obstacles in the path of this relationship. So I'm definitely exploring those kinds of themes within that series. I've always loved the Pandora story. It's something I've thought about for years, and I know there's been some books recently, but I want to find my way into that. I haven't sat down to research that yet, but the one that I am researching is Dracula. So I mean, horror is probably my go-to genre for both books and movies, and I pitched loads of ideas to my agent, and she said, right, I want to do the modern day YA Dracula origin story. So I was like, okay, yes, I should read the book first. So off I went to read the book, and it really surprised me because the book is very different to the movie. And I love the movie, and I love the romance angle of the movie. There's no romance angle in the book, which I was heavily disappointed to discover, because I love to have that element of romance in all of my books, whether it's a slow burner, whether it's an insta lover, whether it's a love triangle, whatever there is. I love it as a good subplot. So I am in the throes of researching the Dracula, and I think because the whole book is told in diary and journal entries, the way I'm imagining it is with lots of WhatsApp messages and TikTok lives and YouTubes and Instagram pictures, and really relying on social media.
I love that.
Tell the story of what happens. So I'm almost finished the book, and then I'm gonna watch the movie again and do some more research and start making notes. But I'm feeling really passionate about this project, and vampires are coming back in, and I love the original story. I've watched, all the Dracula movies from black and white to modern day. So you can tell I'm talking. I'm definitely really, really excited about really getting into this one. So yeah.
That's awesome. We have gimme hands. We want it now. So no pressure.
Yeah.
Please.
All right. And this is our last question. WriteHive's tagline is writing the future we need. So what does that look like for you and your work? Why don't we stay with Marisa?
Sure. And I think we've touched a lot on inclusivity and diversity. And I think those are things that we would probably all agree on that needs to be included in the future of every author's journey. But breadth and exploration. And I think not being afraid to try something new. And what's really interesting being on TikTok and it being one of my favorite places to learn about books and meet other authors is the types of books and the types of authors that are available. You know, within the traditional world, we have these gatekeepers and they say, well, vampires aren't in anymore, or dystopia's not in anymore, or whatever that is. And they decide what the readers are going to be reading. Whereas when you have the power of book talk and how big it's growing and how these huge community of self-published authors are able to write A, what they want to write, and B, give the readers what they actually want to read, we are in this exploratory period where publishing is changing and traditional publishing will probably have to start adopting these genres that they haven't accepted until now. And I'm hoping that that will lead to lots of different mashups of fairy tales with sci-fi and dystopian with as crazy as you can possibly think. And I cannot wait to see what happens in the next 10 years, where we go from here and what kind of books are produced, and that there will be a book for everyone on the shelf and more than one. I think it's a really exciting time to be an author. I'm part of that.
Agree, 1,000,000%. That's awesome. Thank you. Lauren, same to you.
Yeah, so I think, and I'm really with what Marisa is saying here, and I think that publishing is changing. And I know Rebecca touched a little bit on this, but like I also am sort of in the hybrid in between space. Like up to this point, I've worked a lot with indie small presses, medium presses, as opposed to traditional publishing. And so I think that there is, I don't want to say like a prioritization of some of these more diverse voices or just like kooky genres and stories and age groups and genres, and I think indie and small presses are really doing some amazing work in those spaces. And I think especially with social media, the ability to have these stories then be put into people's hands is a little bit easier. And so like what Marisa was saying in terms of TikTok, like book talk, it's huge, and there are some amazing self-pubbed or indie pub books that have somehow hit the New York Times bestseller list or are selling, 4th, 5th round print rounds. And so I think that the publishing is changing, and I think the future is going to look very different. But I think retellings will definitely be a part of that because, with traditional publishing, it's always, vampire stories are out or dystopians out, or, nobody wants to see another Beauty and the Beast retelling. And those things just aren't true. There's so many people who want to see these stories. And I think that that's sort of where we're heading.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just going to add, as a horror reader, like vampires have never been out for me. Never. Mm-hmm. I will read any vampire book I can get my hand on. And when I walk into Waterstones here and they're like, oh, we haven't got any vampire books, I'm like, so I go to Book Talk and I go, where are my vampire authors? So absolutely. Give the readers what they want.
Exactly. I'm like, same, big time.
I just wanted to second everything they said about Book Talk as well. I mean, when I left my first agent, I started self-publishing some of the things I had been working on while I was on sub. And that was amazing for me. I took this it was like a zombie apocalypse romance with vampires, like the vampires fight the zombies for humanity, like they defend humanity against the zombies. And I had the romance aspect in there. And that was the first book of mine that took off as an indie. And it was because I got on TikTok at the same time as I released it. And I am now making a living wage from my writing. And that was the best decision I ever made. Like, I'm with a new agent now. She's amazing. Love her. And she doesn't mind if I keep self-publishing things.
So thank you so much. The time flew by and we've come to the end of our panel. I would like to thank our panelists for talking with us today about fairy tale retellings and their stories. We will be here in the chat to continue answering questions from our WriteHive 2022 attendees, but for our last words, why don't we go around the room and briefly let our viewers know what projects you would like to plug and how to find you after the conference. Rebecca, can we start with you?
Sure. So I guess I'm just plugging, go find me on TikTok. And if you like vampires and zombies and romance all mashed together. Plus I'm on submission with, and I think I can say this because I talked about it a ton on Twitter, but with a Gatsby retelling with vampires. So that's what I'm on submission with. And if it doesn't sell, I'm totally publishing it myself and it's going to be great.
Wow. That is incredible.
Or,
Yes, and it's
send it to me at
it is
and we
like
can talk.
Diverse cast, queer characters, vampires, Gatsby, like in like modern 2020. So I'm super excited about
100 times better than Pride, Prejudice and Zombies, I'm sure. That I just now that you said that, I'm like, why has no one thought of that before? It's very clever. I'm very impressed, Rebecca.
So anyway, that's what I'm working on. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Oh, and the Vela stories, which, I have a series called the Dark Rulers series going on over there. And that's been really fun. And I mean, that has been a big thing for my current success as well, is just writing for Kindle Vela. So yeah.
And you mentioned your TikTok and Twitter. Where can we find you there?
Oh, yes. Okay. So on TikTok, I'm just Rebecca F. Kenney. And on Twitter, I'm Rebecca F. Kenney 1. And on Instagram, I'm Rebecca F. Kenney Books. So I really should standardize all of that. But, just type in my name, you'll probably find me. So
yeah.
Perfect. Lauren, what would you like to plug and how can we find you after the conference?
Yeah, so did I go the right way? Yes. So my most recent book was just released in May. So it's When Other People Saw Us, They Saw the Dead. And it is an anthology of BIPOC Gothic horror. It's been fantastic to edit. So take a look at that. And then in terms of upcoming projects, I have 2 Latinx specific anthologies releasing in October-ish right now, I believe, is we're still finalizing the publication date, but that is covering, I have a YA version of it and an adult version of it, and so it covers multiple genres, including romance, sci-fi, and Gothic horror, and then multiple other anthologies and stuff coming in the works that will be published within the next few years. But you can find me at my website, laurentdavila.com, and then on Twitter at laurengilmore03, and Instagram is Lauren T. Davila.
Thank you very much. And Marisa.
Yes. So Unraveling Luna is my latest book, and launching that on BookTok was amazing. It made it a bestseller for a couple of months. It's back into the low rankings now, but buy it now and maybe it won't be. I've also got the rest of my mermaid series coming out. That's the first one, Secret to the Sea. So that is my kind of Little Mermaid Romeo and Juliet retelling. Luna and another dark fantasy book, The Shadow Keepers, is coming to audio soon. So I'm really excited about that. The people that I've got to do the books are incredible, and just listening to it come to life is absolutely amazing. And then Beyond Justice is my dystopian trilogy. That's the first, and that might be having another book from the point of view of another character. So that's been doing really, really well lately. BookTok tend to like that one quite a lot, the complete trilogy. And as where to find me, my website is marisanoelle.com. I also have the unadjusted.com, and on most social media platforms, so Twitter and Instagram, I'm Marisa Noelle 77. TikTok, I actually have 2. I'm Marisa Noelle 12 and Marisa Noelle Books. I do different things with the different accounts. But yeah, if you like the so if you just Google Marisa Noelle, you'll probably find me, because I'm everywhere. You can't get away from me. So there we go. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Well, that wraps up our panel today. We thank you so much for joining us, and we definitely look forward to meeting you and discussing this more with you all on our Discord. Thank you for joining us.